Hi, I'm Malcolm Stern, and in conjunction with my friends John and Sandra Wilson from Online Events, we're creating a series of podcasts called Slay Your Dragons with Compassion. My book of the same name was conceived and inspired by the suicide of my daughter Melissa and the journey that took me on and the internal resources that I found. All of my guests will have a story to tell around overcoming and ultimately thriving through adversity. Special thanks to the band Stairway, Jim McCarty and Louis Chinamo, for the use of theme music from their album Medicine Dance, and my engineer Owen Santiago. I hope you enjoy this series, and thanks for listening. So welcome to my podcast, Slay Your Dragons with Compassion, which of course I'm doing with my good friends at Online Events. And today I'm very happy to interview a very, very old friend. He is very old, but we're all getting older. But I'm happy to interview my friend Mo Cohen, who's had a very rich and full life. And we've known each other a long time. We've gone through quite a lot together. We've been around each other's bereavements, and also around each other's sort of like joys and other things as well. So it's good friendships are hard to come by. So let's take a look at Mo, your life and what you'd like to explore today in Slay Your Dragons with Compassion, which is about how we overcome adversity. What have been the tools we've used to overcome adversity?
Wow. Do I start right there with what are the adversities that I've faced?
Why not? Why not? Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe it'll mix my autobiography with the adversities, but the thing that comes straight to mind when you say that is that when I was 8 years old, and at that time I lived in North London, my sister was born, and after 2 years, so I was now 10, she was diagnosed as what was then called spastic. Now, obviously, I didn't know about that. I was 10 years old. I wasn't part of that conversation, but I sensed there was something wrong. Something wrong. Just something wrong. And the evidence really came slightly later, because I passed my 11 plus and I went to grammar school. At junior school, I'd been top of the class, and well, actually number 3 to be absolutely authentic.
It's good. Yeah.
But at grammar school, I went from top of the class to bottom of the class. I was, 23 out of 27, 26 out of 27. And so clearly something was going on that was being represented outwardly in that. That's my understanding of it. And it was only years later, much later, that I found out and I understood that there was this trauma in the family. And my mum told me when I was an adult that she and my dad didn't have sex for 2 years or 3 years, that my mum became agoraphobic and didn't go out of the house. She would get to the front door and she would say, "Reggie, I can't go." And now I didn't know any of this until I was really an adult, but I could feel it. I could feel something was going on. And I think the thing that I felt the most was a kind of withdrawal of attention. I wasn't getting attention. No, and my 11-year-old said, "What's going on? Nobody cares. Nobody's noticing me." And this kind of ominous sense that something awful was. And if something awful was going, so this is really childhood illogic, right?
Yeah.
But if something awful is going on, and people are not paying attention to me and not noticing me, and I'm, having trouble at school, and they're not doing anything about it. I must have done something
Uh-huh.
terribly wrong. So I made it all about me, and it's all my fault. And that became my kind of filter on the world. It's
Mm.
something wrong, it's all my fault, I'm to blame. So now, even now as a 75-year-old, as an adult, I only have to get a whiff of I'm being blamed for something, and I go immediately into some kind of defensive mode. But my defensive mode is very attacking, very kind of pugnacious. So that's really the first thing that comes up when you talk about dealing with adversity.
It's interesting. We share that sort of there's some interesting sharings we have because of course you know that my sister was also she wasn't spastic but or what was called spastic in those days, but um, she had mental illness, and my
Yeah,
parents showered her with affection. And then what about me?
yeah,
So I can really hear all of that, that these things, we can be very rational about it, but these
yeah,
things actually stay in our psyches.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting your expression of it. Or what about me? When you said that, I kind of felt myself absolutely physiologically respond to that. It's not my phrase, um, but I get it. What about me? What about
Yeah,
me?
yeah.
Who's there for me? Um, uh, Actually, I mean, in a way, there's also another thing which may or may not be related. It may be a very deep, unconscious kind of precursor, but but obviously the listeners to this pod or viewers to this podcast won't know. But um, when I was born in 1949 in Israel, and Israel was, even though there was an armistice, it was still officially in a state of war. And I was born on a kibbutz up near the northern border, just underneath both the Lebanon and the Syrian borders. So I was born into this state of tension, and particularly because my parents didn't want to be on a kibbutz at the time. My dad wanted to be a teacher in the city and couldn't find a job, so there was a lot of stress. But at that time, the system of kibbutz, which for anybody who doesn't know, is a communal village, a real commune on a large scale. The children were raised communally in baby houses, and I was removed from my mother's bed to being in the baby house. And I think that for years I thought it was, I mean, really until this year, I think, and I'm 75. It was this year that I realized I always had a sense of kind of being abandoned, but I realized this year that I wasn't abandoned. It was a separation, but I wasn't abandoned. So my point is that I grew up with this sense of separation as really as an infant, kind of a pre-verbal, pre-language sense of being separate. And I think that may have played into the what about me, like
Yeah.
being left on your own, even though it's not an abandonment. Nobody's actually not there for you, but it's a felt sense.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
that's very good. Because I think that what happens when we're unable to process things psychologically is that they go very deep into our psyches, and we find ourselves acting out. I found myself acting out in my 70s and in ways that go, bloody hell, what the hell is that? I'm like
yeah,
a child in that
yeah,
moment.
yeah, exactly. So and now you're reminding me, when you said, things getting processed, I'm reminded of a kind of a third adversity, and in a totally different domain. But I went back to live in Israel, and I know the politics around that now. And I have to say to everybody, not in my name, this, what's happening now is definitely not in, not in my name. But when I was there, and it was really a different country in the 1970s, and I was in my 20s, I was on the kibbutz in 1973 when the Yom Kippur War broke out, the Day of Atonement. And we were under fire. My kibbutz, my village, was situated between the River Jordan, just down, and an airstrip, a commercial airstrip. And the Syrians were shelling from Syria to try and hit the airstrip, and they missed the airstrip altogether, and they kept hitting our buildings. So we were under fire, and it was unknown and unexpected, and all the babies and the children were having their siesta at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and we had to get them into the bomb shelters, and we were literally throwing these babies in a human chain, person to person, baby to baby, baby to baby, baby to baby, person to person, to get them underground into safety. And of course the shells were falling all around us. We were in the middle of a shelling attack in a war zone. And jump forward 40 years, and I'm doing my first solo autobiographical theater performance, which I can talk about maybe in a moment. But I was doing a show, I was writing the show, and I found myself drawn back to this moment and writing, I didn't know I could still hear the sounds of the shells. I didn't know I could still feel the tremors in the ground. And as I'm writing this 40 years later, I'm reduced to tears. I'm in floods of tears. I mean, I just can't control all of these feelings. And I realized, well, I was working with a theater director, and we processed this very, very slowly. And he said, this is a trauma reviving itself.
Uh-huh.
And I had not realized in that moment 40 years ago in 1973 that I had been in the grip of a trauma, because the nature of trauma is when you're in it, you're not there. Whatever the trauma is, you're gone, you're absent. But much later, when you revive it, when it is revived by one trigger or another, you're in the middle of it. It's not happening, but you're again right in the middle of it, as if it's real. And it took me weeks to very slowly with Mark Drummond to process that through a process that we called tritation, which is a chemical term for drop by drop by drop.
Yeah.
So what we did in the show was we drew a huge circle in chalk on the floor that became the trauma. That was the representation of the trauma area. And we made the show around the circle, not in the circle. And it was only when I felt ready that I was able to step into the circle and confront the trauma, like facing the shadow. And I did it with my great grandma's brass candlesticks. And I made a prayer that right now I can't remember, but I walked in with my history into the trauma,
Yes,
and recited a prayer as a way of completing that process. It was remarkable. So now I can talk about the event without I can certainly remember it, but without,
you're not re-traumatized now.
Yeah, without re-triggering the trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think you've come a really long way. I know that you've when you dive into something, you dive into it, and so you dived into, in your late 60s or early 70s, you dived into solo autobiographical theatre, and you've in fact got a PhD in that now, and so you've actually really given yourself to something that has meaning for you. So you've kept recreating yourself, and probably at 90 you'll recreate yourself as something else again. But for now, I know that you're a coach and a therapist, but you're also now a performer and someone who is actually using theatre as a psychological tool as well. So tell us a bit about that.
Okay, so there's something in what you just said that I need to tweak,
Yep.
which is, and this is maybe hard to distinguish, but I'll have a go. Yes, I trained in psychology. I trained in clinical psychology. I was a clinical psychologist. I left the world of clinical psychology because I wasn't terribly interested in people as patients and the whole medical model, and I moved much more into transformational and existential psychology and humanistic psychology, which I found much more rewarding and meaningful. But then I had a personal experience, a literal awakening, where I experienced for the first time what it means to be 100 and completely responsible for your life, for your entire life. And the way that I experienced it was, I am the source of my own experience. Everything that happens to me it may be triggered by the outside world, but my response to it is absolutely entirely my own. And in fact, in that moment of awakening, it was in my head, or in fact, maybe in the conversation that I was having with the coach, was, you mean there's nothing happening out there? And that's my kind of go-to default enlightened, if you like, position, which is not position, but location, is there's nothing going on out there except what I am generating, except what I am manifesting. And so that allows me a high degree of freedom, but it's not to do with psychology. It is to do with the past and filters and stories and narratives, but it's not to do with psyche or psychology in the way that I understand things. It's to do with narratives and stories. And so I've moved from psychology to what's called ontology, which is the nature of being. Who are you being? Who are you being? Not what are you, but who are you? What is the being of being? And so the theater work that I do asks that question. Who are you being? What stories or narratives, and they can be transgenerational, that are passed on, which stories are you in the grip of and you would like to be free of? Now, if we come back to Ruth, that's my sister, who obviously is no longer spastic and she's no longer handicapped. She's now learning disabled. So she's been through all of those labels. And then one day maybe in my 60s, I was reading, my mum was still alive. My mum gave me some old school reports that she had kept. I think particularly from my sixth form, lower sixth. And in there, my headmaster was real old school kind of Edwardian headmaster in, black gown and hat, and his name was E.W. Maynard Potts. E.W. Maynard Potts. And he was my absolute nemesis. I was terrified of him. He'd caned me for inciting revolution and things like that. I mean, it's just, I was still getting the cane at 16 or 17. It's probably a trauma that's unprocessed. Anyway, Mr. Potts had written in several of these school reports, Morris isn't fulfilling his potential. Morris, if only Morris would knuckle down, Morris could be one of our better students. And in reading it as an adult in my 60s, I went, oh my God, Mr. Potts noticed, right? He saw me. And I went, of all people, it's like, of all people, my parents didn't see me, but Potts saw me. Potts was there. And I went, if I got that story wrong, that nobody saw me, what else did I get wrong? And in that kind of moment, all my stories just kind of, it was a felt sense. It was an awakening to, I'm living inside all these stories and they're not true. They're not even there. They're kind of, they're not even present. Then I don't have the story. I have the memory of I have the memory of the event, and I have the interpretation of the event, and it's all made up. And it was, in that moment, it was so incredibly freeing and so incredibly liberating. So it's like a lighthouse which has windows out onto the same ocean over and over again, and each time you go around the spiral staircase and you look out of the window, you're looking on the same ocean, but you're looking at it from a different angle. And that's what's been happening to me. It's like I keep revisiting the same territory but from a different angle, and each angle reveals something new, and each time it's more and more liberating. And in my life and in my work as a coach and a facilitator and a trainer and an educator and a teacher, in all of those areas, what I'm really interested in fundamentally is people being free. Just people's freedom to, you could say freedom to be authentic, or freedom to fulfill their potential, and freedom from. So freedom from the grip of unwanted, undesirable narratives, constricting stories, limiting stories, also from hunger and freedom and oppression and war. So, and that's kind of who I like to think I am in the world, is that stand.
Yes. That's great. Can I just take you back a little bit, because you said before about not in my name, and I'm really with you on that as well. But I'd like to expand on that a little bit. Just looking at because that's obviously a very hot subject at the moment. But could you expand on that a little bit for us?
When I lived in Israel, I went to live in Israel in 1970. It was after the 1967 war and before the 1973 war. It was a radically different country than it is now, dramatically different country than it is now. And I was on the left. I was on the left wing. On the left of the left. I was right at the beginning of the Peace Now movement. I was out there going to meetings, working on behalf of at the time it was called Moked. It was a very, very, very tiny offshoot of the labor movement, and I've always been pro returning all the territories. For years I was a proponent of a two-state solution. I think now I'm much more I would advocate for a one-state solution. I don't, like one country that includes Arabs and Jews, Muslims and Israelis, and that it is an integrated society in the Middle East, and I absolutely stand for peace in the Middle East, not just for Israel but for everybody, for freedom for everybody, for the rights of all human beings in the Middle East. I'm against the occupied territories. I consider them to be occupied territories, not liberated land, and that's what I mean. Not in my name.
I think it's very important that people like you do take a stand with things like this. That actually it's because it's so easy to get caught up in the fervor of patriotism, which I feel like is a disease of our time. That we can whip people into a frenzy.
Yeah, but it's a stand. It's not a position. I'm not positional about this. I certainly don't think I have an answer. God, if I had an answer, people would be banging at my doors. But it's complex. But I do think that the resolution. First of all, I think the problem is the problem, not the people. the problem is the problem. This is an idea that is Michael White's from narrative therapy. The problem is the problem, never the person, never the person. So, and in 1976, 77, I can't remember, the Camp David Accords, Menachem Begin and Arafat shook hands and made a deal, made a peace agreement. And what they both, I beg your pardon, Anwar Sadat, not Arafat, Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt.
Yeah.
And that peace agreement with Egypt is still intact. It still exists today. But what those two leaders had to do was give up the story. They had to put the past in the past and not be in the grip, the self-righteous grip of I'm right about my story. So in that moment, two people in opposition gave up the story. And when you give up the story like that, this is what Martin Buber calls an encounter. You know, there's a meeting. Buber said all real living is meeting. And they were able to meet because there was nothing in the in-between. And that's when possibilities that are beyond the horizon right now. We can't see them. They're beyond the horizon. But when you give up the story, things that are unpredictable and beyond the horizon can start to appear in conversation, in language. And that was kind of the miracle of the 70s in Israel, was to have a peace agreement. And even though, you know, there's a war going on, that peace agreement still holds. And so they've shown that it's possible, but it takes giving up the story. And that's what it takes for all of us. And it's not an out there, they have to do it. It's an in here, I have to. I don't have to, I have a choice. But that's in my agency, because who I am as an essential being is possibility. I am possibility. Not I have, but I am possibility.
That's interesting. And also, it's interesting that Anwar Sadat apparently spent 3 years in solitary confinement, and in that time, he managed to get past his story as well. So it's something about that he was put through a very sort of tortuous process, but in that process, he became bigger than he had been.
Yeah. And I think there's something in that phrase about being bigger. There's you know, we talk a lot in our world of human potential. We talk about surrender. And surrender, in my understanding, in how I've come to understand it, is a giving yourself to something bigger, is a letting it work on you rather than you have to work on everything.
That's good. So you're at this stage in your life now where you know there's a lot more. It's interesting. We talk about the seasons of our life, and you and I are in the winters of our lives now, and that could be sort of quite depressing. But it's also a sort of the winter is the time of contemplation, and what I'm hearing is a lot of contemplation has gone into who you are and what makes you tick, and so there's a whole lot of exploration still. And I think what's great is you haven't sort of gone, okay, well I'm going to retire and just sort of you know shut down and everything. You're going, what do I want to open up into now?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that you put exploration and contemplation into the same kind of pack, into the same frame, because I was watching, I stumbled in looking through some back emails that I had registered for a course on creative thinking with online with Elizabeth Gilbert, Eat, Pray, Love. And so I went back and I reviewed this program. I did it again. And she's a remarkable woman. Not just because of her success. I mean, you know, she recognizes that her success was a complete fluke and had nothing to do with her. But she's a remarkable woman because she understands. It's not it's not, it's kind of it's like getting a joke, understands. It's a comprehension, not a understanding. She comprehends that curiosity is our way to discovery. She talks in this program that I was doing about sometimes you don't feel passionate. This is not about following your passion, because sometimes we just don't have, passion can come and go. It's turned off. It's you wake up in the morning, you're not feeling it. But the thing that you always have agency around is being curious. So I remain curious. And so when I finished my PhD, okay, let me just backtrack, because I'm just kind of making connections in my mind. You were talking about being you called me a performer. So one of the main people that I wrote about in my PhD was a Polish Catholic theater director called Jerzy Grotowski. I'm sure I'm not saying it correctly, but it's something like Jerzy Grotowski. Anyway, Jerzy Grotowski. And Grotowski defined, first of all, Grotowski loved Buber. He loved Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher, and he walked around with his book, I, Thou, in his pocket, Grotowski in his pocket. So I went, oh, I love Buber as well. And then it turned out that Grotowski loved Carlos Castaneda. And I went, oh my God, my BA project in anthropology was about Carlos Castaneda. And there were all these kind of connections that I had with Grotowski. And I just kind of fell in love with this man as a director, and kind of gave myself over, even though he's 33 years older than me, no longer alive. I just kind of surrendered to his teachings, and included them in my PhD. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that Grotowski called performer a man, but it could be, he means a human being when he says a man, a person of knowledge. He's following Carlos Castaneda and Don Juan, that to be performer is to be somebody who is awake and aware. And so when I finished my PhD, my tutors and my external examiner all said that I had developed a methodology which basically is the process of putting on a one-person show, a one man or one woman performance, and becoming that person of knowledge, a warrior, a spiritual warrior. And at the time, I didn't really want to call it a method. I was kind of anti or opposed to having a method. I thought it was too formulaic. But now, 2 years, 3 years later, after I finished my PhD and continuing to be curious and to research and read and understand and grasp new ideas, I went, okay, it's time for this method. I went, okay, it's a method to see the light of day in the world. And so this winter of my life is going to be about transformational theater, and I'm calling it ontodrama. So onto is being. Onto is what ontology is, the study of being. Any word that has ology at the end of it means study of. So you have biology, study of life, anthropology, study of people. And onto drama is the drama, the theater of being. And so so now I'm going to work more and more with people as a director, because I think the directing is the next stage of coaching. I think this is the phenomenon of putting your story on stage, the phenomenon of theater, of putting your story on stage, not as a repeat of your story, but as demonstrating the liberation from your story, your newfound freedom is going to be my way of working in groups and individually.
It's interesting because I think drama has the capacity to take us out of our intellect and into a place where we bypass the normal stuff that goes on, so we get caught in our mental patterns. And of course, as you know, I've been working for a long time, although we've had questions about this with psychodrama, but my version of psychodrama. But I can see that that's when the magic happens. That when I get people into a dramatic state, that's when we see that they can get past their tram lines that they're normally stuck in.
Yeah. So this is all about being in a dialogue, literally being in a conversation with the invisible world. That's what art is about, whether it's Rothko's murals, or theater or music or sculpture. But once you bring yourself to the piece, to the music, to the play, to the picture, once you literally bring your whole self and you are 100% present, and the performer or the piece is there in its presence, and there's nothing in between, miracles occur. I mean, literally miracles occur. Things that people were, it's like, I didn't know I could be that way. I didn't know I could have a life like that.
Yes.
I didn't know. People fall into each other's arms after being 20 years in conflict. Literally, I think theater is miraculous. Language, theater, performance, it's miraculous.
Well, I think it takes us into an altered state of consciousness, doesn't it? That's the thing.
Yeah.
Beauty of it.
Yeah, and the beauty of doing onto drama over a long period of time is, Grotowski called it verticality. You go from our kind of coarse, heavy material self into up the lift shaft to making connections in with the invisible world, and that's what I meant. You're in a dialogue with the universe. And this is what McGilchrist's work has all been about recently, is about this. He calls it the nothing. These are my words, not his, but there's a nothing out there that's a something. It's not a void. It's a kind of an active ingredient that we are co-creating with moment by moment with the universe.
I think that's what I was sort of thinking about earlier when I was talking about being in the winter of our lives, is that actually there's more capacity being in that space of contemplation to explore the invisible world.
Yeah.
We're not caught in the same patterns. Of course we are, but there's a freeing at some degree of those patterns.
So when I had an awakening, I mentioned before I had this awakening. So the awakening was in the S training, that was the precursor now to the Landmark Forum and all of that. Very, very rigorous 2-week process consisting of primarily of 2 weekends. And at the end of this, it's like, actually, I've kind of lost my thread because I was responding to something you were saying. But my honest, authentic experience in that moment was I was completely connected. I mean, it's like I was connected to the universe was connected to me. There was, in fact, even saying that it's not accurate, Malcolm. There was me, this hand, left hand, and there was the universe, right hand. But it wasn't left hand and right hand. It was one. That's what it was. It was this sense of oneness of me individually, but also me in the universe. It was an entire event. It was even beyond an experience. It was just this kind of awakening event. Now, words never ever absolutely capture it. But I always have it there as an anchor to draw on, to relocate myself as whole and complete. And 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 I had that again with my theatre work. There were moments of like realization that me and my great grandpa Morris Meyer, were only 3 generations apart. And in that moment that I realized it was real. And I said to Mark, my director, I said, "Oh my God, Mark, he's in my blood. It's like he's in my blood."
Mm.
And then I performed not about him. I performed as him, and he came to life. And so now that was amazing to have that realization. But what it allowed me to do was then to kind of recreate that in other characters and to see the world from their point of view. And so it's like, so if I took my grandpa, that's Morris's son, my grandpa, Harry, who was really angry. But once I was able to play him, I was able to see the world through his eyes. And like and now if you're in a conflict with your brother or your sister or your mom or your dad, and you're able to portray them, you evacuate yourself, you become them, you see the world from their point of view, you suddenly kind of find a place. You're escaping the tram lines. You find that place of compassion, of forgiveness, of love. Love just floods. It like floods back in.
Yes. And of course, it's that place of when once you understand, you can no longer sit in the same judgment as before because you see that they are products of their world and their conditioning and their upbringing as
Yeah.
well.
And you see that the judgments belong to you.
Yeah,
They've actually got nothing to do with them. Nothing. They're only to do with you. They're your judgments. And who made us the judge?
very good.
Who made us the judge? That yeah.
Good question, and that's where we'll move across to my final question as well, which is at the end of each podcast, I ask my guests to say, what are the dragons you've had to slay? What's the difficulties you've had to overcome in order to be who you are?
um, blame, shame,
Mm.
humiliation. I felt a lot of humiliation and shame around my sister Ruth, and blamed her for my life and for what wasn't working. I'd love it if I was able to say forgiveness, but there are people in my life that I still feel really angry, and I know from that it's not always easy to forgive. It's a grace. You can't just say to somebody as a coach or a therapist, well, the answer is forgiveness. Yes, it may be the answer is forgiveness, but sometimes it's quite a treacherous journey to finding that place of forgiveness. And I know that I'm carrying certain things around with me that are not good for me. They are detrimental to my health and well-being. And I haven't found that sweet spot yet. But blame, shame, humiliation are what I've had to confront, and the dragons that I've had to slay. So I would say I've done 97% of that, not 98, but there's a little bit left to go.
Oh, I wish you great joy in your 2% exploration as well. Because I think forgiveness is one of the great, as you say, it's a grace. It's not something we go, I think I'll forgive them. And
Yeah,
often people jump to forgiveness and when it's not real.
yeah.
So that's what I'm hearing. Thank you very much, Mo. I've really appreciated having you on the show and to share some of your life experience. And and your wisdom as well. So much appreciated.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
Great.
Um,